I'm Kevin Maloney, the Communications and Member Relations Director for the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. With us we have Michael Frieda, First Selectman of North Haven and a member of the CCM Board of Directors, and our Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, Joe DeLong.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here today. Appreciate the opportunity. Yesterday, CCM released a report that was really part of a 9-month effort that was comprised of a large panel of municipal leaders, 21 municipal leaders to be exact, reaching across all demographics of the state. We had, of course, from the political affiliations, we had Democrats and Republicans. We had, of course, urban, suburban, and rural representation, and we made sure that representation reached into every cog area of the state as well. So we were hitting all of the corners and all the different demographics. And the great thing about that, obviously, was those people brought the Connecticut feel, the hometown feel, the understanding of our local issues to the table. But to bring balance, we also hired outside consultants who were policy experts and economic experts to come in and work, with these municipal officials to try to develop a holistic plan or a holistic approach to changing the way that the relationship works in Connecticut between the state and the local level. And essentially what you have coming out of this is a report that is, if you read it, mostly comprised of ways that we can reduce spending. It's a very spending reduction heavy report and a series of recommendations, many of which I know that Mike will be able to talk about a lot of these, but many of which fall around sharing services both across town lines. A lot of people think of sharing services, they always think of across town lines, but there's also a lot in this report that's very important that talks about how to share services and make things more efficient and effective within a municipality between functions like boards of education and local government and those types of areas. So that's the first section of the report in terms of recommendations. The second section of the report is general cost-saving measures, not necessarily service sharing initiatives, but just other things that can take place to reduce the cost of taxpayers within government and the services that municipal government offers. And then the last part of the report that people tend to focus on the most is the revenue diversification piece. And the revenue diversification piece was built around trying to finally get the state of Connecticut and local governments away from their over-reliance or over-dependence on the property tax. And, obviously when you talk about revenue diversification, that gets into increases in other areas. It gets into funding mechanisms from other directions. But the important thing about that is that those other areas or other directions are competitive areas and competitive directions, not only within the rest of the nation, but particularly within the region, within the other New England states. And one area where we know we're not competitive is in the property tax, because we have this continued over-reliance on the property tax. We're not competitive in that area at all. It hurts our economic growth. It hurts home ownership. It particularly holds back our urban centers for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. And I think this has been known for years, but very few people have really had the political will or the courage to take it on and say there is a better way, there is a smarter way, and there's a way that we can do it that puts us in a more competitive posture for our urban centers to thrive, and more importantly, or not, maybe not more importantly, but as importantly, for our urban centers to thrive without us doing the Robin Hood effect where we try to reach into our more successful suburbs or rural areas and just take money from them and redistribute it to the urban centers. That's not a structural fix, it's a good long-term fix. It's a short-term fix of picking winners and losers. And what this report doesn't do is it doesn't pick winners and losers. It brings in all these different demographics and makes sure that there's something here for everybody and sets us up on a structural path forward for success. So that's primarily the basis, of how it was laid out and all of the recommendations. There's a series of key findings in the beginning of the report that talk about why we need to do these things, and many of them people know. A lot of them people may not know. Some of the things that you'll learn in these key findings is that when we talk about local governments in Connecticut, we know we're small geographically, but when it comes to spending, as compared to local governments in the rest of the country, we're actually some of the most efficient local governments in the nation. And that's not a viewpoint coming from CCM or coming from municipal leaders. That's coming from the outside consultants who do this without really any bias at all, and those are data-driven facts. We also, while the state will talk about how much of the state budget goes to municipal aid, our cities and towns actually, in comparison with cities and towns across the country, receive less aid from the state and from the federal government than what the national averages are. So, you know, the reality from a data standpoint is not that the cities and towns are doing a bad job now, but that economic times are different. We can no longer rely on the state. We need to have more tools in the toolbox. But those tools can't be just extra tools. They have to be tools that set us up in a competitive posture with our surrounding states, and we believe all these recommendations in here do that. So that's kind of like an opening statement. If it's all right with Michael, I'll let him, if he wants to make some room, we'll of course take questions from you and then answer them more individually, but if there was anything you wanted to add.
Absolutely. So it's a delight to be here. Thank you very much. I wanted to tell you that I'm actually playing 3 different roles right now. I'm here as North Haven's chief elected official. I'm on the executive board of CCM, and I work very closely with Joe and Kevin and the whole CCM staff. And I also am on the executive committee of our South Central Council of Government. So I see things both from a local, regional, and a state level. I was delighted to be part of the Shared Services Committee. We in North Haven have had an outstanding relationship with many of our surrounding cities and towns. There is a state statute in Section 7-478 that allows interlocal agreements to take place among municipalities without being subject to any collective bargaining agreements. And one of the interlocal agreements that I'm part of is a 5-town consortium at the Covanta Municipal Waste Facility. I'm actually chairman of that board. What we're asking, and one of the things we've come up with, is to broaden that state statute language to include language that says we can share services among municipalities without being subject to or mandated by any collective bargaining agreements. So what would those shared services be? Those shared services could be in the form of public works, sharing equipment, sharing trucks, perhaps adding resources or getting resources from another city or town if we're strapped from a labor standpoint. We're looking to see how we can compress costs locally by sharing services and by not being subject to any collective bargaining arrangements. We have an outstanding relationships with the unions in North Haven. Our collective bargaining processes go very well. In North Haven and North Branford, as an example, we'll share public works equipment. One specific piece of equipment would be a catch basin drain flusher that North Branford has a truck that we'll borrow occasionally with our people. So we work very well. We're not sure that type of arrangement or relationship exists across the state, and we don't want to see that type of relationship or that type of shared activity service, as a specific example, be mandated by any collective bargaining agreements or arrangements. In the area of the intermunicipality efficiencies, many people across the state of Connecticut don't realize that largely there's a duplication of services on the city side or the town side and the Board of Education side. And what we would propose is, specifically in the non-instructional aspect of education, not in the classrooms, but in what we call the back room, whether it be finance, operations management, transportation, we see a great opportunity to compress costs at a local level by not having a duplication of services, not having a duplication of resources, and not having a duplication of added cost in our municipal budgets. Because the reality is this, with what's happening at the state level, we know as municipal leaders that we're going to be cut back on municipal aid. The design of this whole program is to not have the immediate cutbacks that all of us are going to receive be transferred back into an immediate property tax increase at the local level. So a lot of the things we're looking to do, shared services from an intermunicipality standpoint, eliminating perhaps duplicative services between the cities and towns and boards of education, are all designed to compress costs at the local level, but also have more of a regional cooperation network that we think is very important. And finally, one of the things that we were involved with on the Shared Services Committee was we realized that in many districts across the state, school districts, special ed needs are not being attended to. With over 70,000 special ed students across the state of Connecticut, with the money that's put into it, we think there's a better way to do it, and many of us in a bipartisan fashion feel that it should be something that the state handles. Special education be run by the state, to give some relief to those municipalities that cannot perform the service the way it should be, and to overall help the very important aspect of special education across the state level. That's kind of a summary of the committee that I sat on, the Shared Services Committee.
Are you ready for questions?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer any.
I would like to just go off topic for a minute from the report because I have a question and I don't want to dominate. I usually have a lot of questions and
Sure.
I want to let the staff get involved. As you know, President Trump signed some orders yesterday that had to do with immigration and had to do with sanctuary cities and would cut off federal funding to so-called sanctuary cities, of which we know that, at least in an informal way, we do have some in Connecticut, most specifically New Haven, and the mayor made it clear yesterday that the city of New Haven will continue to protect all its residents, and the police department made it clear that they would continue on their non-enforcement of federal law. What I'm wondering is what is CCM's position on that vis-a-vis concern about any loss of federal funding in Connecticut?
Yeah, a couple things. Number one, CCM is part of a larger national organization called the National League of Cities. And the National League of Cities is taking a lead on this issue, trying to coordinate how all cities across the country are going to deal with this. So, as we have different departments that deal with different areas, we're also working in conjunction in a larger group or a larger consortium with the National League of Cities. And I think that their approaches and their recommendations and their platform, will probably be unveiled in the days ahead. I know that they're already very actively working on this. In fact, they had a nationwide conference call last week with the different last night to deal with, this discussion. One thing I'd like to point out that I think most people do understand is the term sanctuary city is a very general, very broad term. And I don't believe that any of our cities in Connecticut are violating any federal laws. Whether they consider themselves a sanctuary city or not, whatever that broad term is, I still believe that all of them are following the law as is applied under the Constitution. Now, there may be some legal battles that ensue under that, but there is certainly some suggestion, I believe, by people far more intelligent than I am, that the president's executive order is not even constitutional and can't even be upheld. So I think these are things in the days and perhaps weeks ahead that'll be ironed out, and we'll certainly work in conjunction very closely with the National League of Cities and how those issues are addressed. But obviously we will do everything in our power to fight to maintain federal funding, because as I mentioned earlier, Connecticut cities and towns, as well as, frankly, from a revenue diversification standpoint, the state of Connecticut's budget receives far less federal funding than what our neighboring states do in the rest of the country. We receive very, very little federal funding to begin with, and to further take those funds away would almost put us at an unprecedented level of being completely on our own and having no support. And that's not the role of the federal government, to starve out cities across the country.
Thank you very much. And just to be clear, in my reference there to the police department, that was a comment with regard simply to immigration issues. Their policy is not to ask people what their immigration status is.
Sure.
Just to be clear, I'm sure they do uphold the Constitution and
Absolutely.
all its laws. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I'm curious about the shared services between boards of education and the city side of things. I know some places may have tried it, but most seem to be very strict on keeping those two separate because they're governed differently. They have different boards ruling them. They don't want people from the city determining anything with payroll or anything like that. So how do you suggest kind of getting over some of those obstacles?
Well, again, in a second, I'll defer to Michael because he deals with this hands-on, but I'll just tell you more globally from our perspective. Board of Education budgets, our municipal leaders don't have any line item oversight. There's no transparency within those budgets. And what will happen, unfortunately, at times, municipal leaders individually, a lot of them will come and say, we have a great relationship with our Board of Education. So a lot of times this doesn't apply to every town. And sometimes it might not apply to a town until there is a change of the guard. But what can happen sometimes is the Board of Education budget comes in and the municipal leader looks at it and says, there's an assistant superintendent in here that's hiring 2 administrative assistants, and I have an administrative assistant in my office that has plenty of capacity that she could do both roles or he could do both roles. And we'll go back and say, I really think that we have capacity to cover this. I think the budget's inflated because of it. You need to cut this out. Well, you can't tell them to cut that out or to look at it. You can only give oversight to the bottom line. So if the municipal leader tells the Board of Education, I need you to reduce this budget by 1%, what the Board of Education in some cases will do is then they'll bring back a budget and they'll cut out the band, or eliminate the football team, or do something that they know will upset the parents. And then when the parents get all upset, they say, well, don't blame me, the town official said that I had to do it, when that was never the town official's intent. So one of the things that we think is important, not just with municipal budgets, but with the Board of Education budgets, that there's line item oversight, that we can scrutinize these budgets in each one of these expenditure areas to see if they make sense. Because where things, in a lot of cases, their budgets are very justified. And I'm not suggesting that they're overinflated or fat, but what I am suggesting is that there are efficiencies. For example, we have communities where a town, the city will, or the municipality will plow the snow right up to the driveway of the school, and then they'll pass, that snow plow will pass the Board of Education snow plow on the same road coming in to plow the road and up to the school entrance, which is just crazy. Those are the types of things that we have to get away from. And I think, part of our belief is having some more transparency and line item scrutiny within those budgets will allow that dialogue to be done on a greater level. A lot of cases they can have the same finance officer. It's all going into the same mill rate. A lot of cases, instead of having a maintenance supervisor for each individual school, you could have somebody who covered a region. Much like, it's a terrible word in Connecticut, but much like county governments do all over the country, they have a maintenance supervisor who supervises all the schools within a county, not just one person for each school. So there are a variety of areas. None of it's one size fits all, but it's all about creating the opportunity to have that dialogue and that transparency and that oversight, which doesn't exist right now, so we can avoid a lot of these duplication of services. We have little small schoolhouses in Connecticut that are almost similar to one-room schoolhouses that you would think of back in Little House on the Prairie that have a superintendent and a principal both at the schoolhouse. And I think we need to look at that and say, does that really make sense? And the times, I believe, call for that, but I'll defer to you to...
Well, Joe gave a great overview. In North Haven, as an example, we have tried to start the shared services aspect with the Board of Ed and things like winter maintenance. If the Board of Ed grounds crew needs a plow or a truck or something done that they can't get to, we will do that. The purchase of Clear Lane, which is a de-icer during the winter, we have that in our Public Works Department. So rather than have the Board of Ed purchase that separately, they come to our Public Works garage to do that. But we've fallen short in other areas. As an example, we have 2 separate ground crews for baseball fields and sports fields, one with the Board of Ed for the Board of Ed fields and one for the town. We see that there can be an efficiency there down the road by consolidating that. Again, it's a non-instructional or non-educational aspect of the Board of Education budget. But when you have 2 separate unions and 2 separate grounds crews who really can work very well together because they all get along, but with 2 separate vertical silos, if you will, these are the areas that sometimes add more cost to Board of Ed budgets. Now, in North Haven, as an example, over 60% of our budget is for the Board of Ed. But yet, if there's a question from the tax-paying citizens as to why a position was added or why a raise was given, who gets the call? The chief elected official. We have absolutely no oversight over the budget other than to prepare and present, or have presented to us and have voted in a referendum an aggregate dollar amount. So for those of us, and most of us, and just about all of us, all we have responsibility for is to say, you're going to, okay, you want 53 million this year, that's what you get, and the public votes on it, but we have no oversight, or we can say nothing about that budget. Now, here,
Go ahead.
just one final point on this. Here's the good news in North Haven. We work closely with the superintendent, and I would hope other municipalities have gone down this road. We've said to our superintendent, Dr. Bob Cronin, who I have a very close relationship with, if you've got all of the dollars to spend, let's not get into a situation where we spend it just for the sake of spending it. If you deliver a surplus, I will put it in the general fund with a special designation for the North Haven Board of Education, and we will spend that surplus back for you, give it back to you to fund future capital improvements, whether they be new computers, we did this for Common Core a few years ago, whether it be for technology like we did this past year in the elementary schools. So every dollar you save in your budget, I'm going to give it back to you to put into a tangible aspect back into the school system, which ends up taking out a future taxpayer expense that would have been budgeted for anyway. And that's worked very successfully for us in North Haven. And that's the type of communication I think we need more across the state to help compress costs and take future taxpayer capital expenses out. Just this past year, $455,000 surplus in the Board of Ed. We spent $360,000 back into upgrading all of the computers for in classrooms at our elementary schools. If we didn't have that agreement, that $300,000+ would have been an upcoming taxpayer's expense. So there's a lot of shared services, there's a lot of consolidation, but again, in the non-instructional aspect. Finance directors, transportation, maybe there's a way to aggregately purchase a bus contract for multiple municipalities. That's a big expense in a Board of Ed budget. Those are some of the things.
But that's something that the town leader and the superintendent would have to agree on. It's not up to the town leader, just because they could, if you have a more transparent budget and they can see it, the town leader can't just say, you have to do this.
Right.
Right, you don't have control in that
That's
way, so
right.
you still have to come to an agreement.
Yes.
There are towns out there now that are sharing finance directors, are sharing IT directors, are sharing public works functions. So, and that's not in just the last year or two. Madison, I'm pretty sure, shares a finance director. Mansfield has incorporated their IT services across both the town hall and the other side. So, towns have been doing this kind of, and we're trying to accelerate their ability to make those decisions when it makes the most sense.
So what do you have to do that? I mean, is it still all voluntary, and you're just sort of pointing out to people that this is just much more reasonable approach?
Well, one of the proposals speaks to those kinds of issues where you would need a change in charter, or you wouldn't need a change, and there's existing statutes that says, anything a town, in essence, does on its own, they have an innate ability to cooperate with another town. So there's broad statutory authority that exists right now, but obviously we're trying to accelerate those powers, but have them be in a way that the towns have the ability to couple where it makes the most sense, whether it's 2 towns or 3 towns or 4 towns, that ultimately good local decision-making should drive that regional process.
And to that point, Joe referenced it earlier, out of 169 cities and towns in Connecticut, I would say that 99.9% of them, the municipal leaders, the municipal CEOs, would like line-by-line oversight over the Board of Ed budgets. That's something we can't do right now.
Well, can I ask then, I find it very interesting that that it's been very clear in what you said, that you're looking at non-educational aspects in terms of that kind of cost savings. And what I'm wondering is that what motivates that? Is that because in Connecticut, people are so kind of connected to their child's education, and we do have so much home rule, so to speak, in terms of municipalities and that education. And so my question is that because this is more amenable to the residents of Connecticut than talking about getting into their education systems and sharing some of those educational services? And does that also play into the state and special ed part of that, to make it more amenable to people?
Yeah, I think you have a couple different issues there. First off, especially as it applies to special education, part of this is driven by the MBR, the minimum budget requirement. And what will happen in some communities is you will have very high special education costs because they're serving a lot of special education students. And those students may time out of the system in terms of they graduate, the parents or families may move on. And we see this in a lot of small communities in Connecticut where they have to incur all these special education costs, and then those special education students are no longer in the system, but because of the MBR, they have to continue to budget as if they were, and so what happens is that money just gets cannibalized in the budget somewhere because the budget's saying you have to budget for a need that you no longer have to meet, built within the MBR. But to speak to the other part of your question a little bit, just as a parent, I have 2 young children, and I can tell you, parents who support their children and to get involved in their children's education, you're right. You have a tendency that if the Board of Education or someone reaches out and says, please show up and support our budget this week as a parent, it's important for your child's education, you want to kind of say, yeah, I'm on my child's side, I'm on my child's team. And so you just, to some degree, a lot of times almost show up blindly in support of those things without questioning, is there ways to be more efficient without getting into the classroom? And that's what we're really talking about here. And I think if you look at the report, and anybody wants to read the report, on page 25 of the report, there's a bullet point that just says, change state law to allow town governments to require consolidation and or sharing of non-instructional services and resources between school districts and the municipality in which they are located. And it basically is a recommendation that state law, a direct recommendation that state law change that says that local governments can step in and say, if we can deliver these same services without duplicating them, then we're going to sit down and figure out a way to do that. The other recommendation here is not directed to education, it's directed more broadly, but it impacts education, is a recommendation that has to do with sharing services when 2 or more bargaining units are involved. And that recommendation basically says that if you are trying to go into a service sharing agreement, whether it's within a community or if it's directed more outside of a community across state line or across town lines, and you have 2 or more bargaining units, that basically those 2 bargaining units are thrown out and a new bargaining unit is assigned to work for everybody. Because that's one of the things that makes service sharing very, very difficult, is this crossover of having 2 or 3 or 4 different bargaining units that you have to deal with to try to accomplish one common goal. And it's not that we don't want these employees to have the bargaining units representing them. We just think it needs to be one bargaining unit that's representing the global interest of all of the employees involved, as opposed to these competing bargaining units. But a lot of times you might get 1 or 2 of them to agree and the third one holds out because they want to show their value that you should join our unit as opposed to being part of that unit because look, we're fighting harder for our people than they're fighting for you. It just creates layers and additional costs that aren't needed. And in the end, it doesn't really accomplish anything. It drives up cost, it delays time, and it puts up obstacles to getting things done that otherwise everybody might be in agreement with. So those are a couple of the key recommendations in those areas that I think would affect, if adopted, would affect that ability to have these more cooperative arrangements with boards of education.
I just had a question about the pilot. I mean, that's a very big, important issue in New Haven.
Sure.
Not close to being funded the way it is in statute. I mean, for a long time, if it ever was. I don't know if it ever really was. But your suggestion that in New Haven, it's obviously the hospital and the universities. So would this be a voluntary situation? I mean, how would you force
Yeah,
people to actually come up with the
let me explain
difference?
that part of the proposal, because I think the part you're referring to, if the rest of the proposal is adopted, never happens. That's the nice thing about it, and I'll explain. The state tax panel study that was done over a year ago, that was commissioned by the legislature, one of the things that the tax panel study said was, as it applies to the sales tax in Connecticut, and you have to remember the state tax panel study was put out with a caveat, and the caveat was it had to be revenue neutral. It was never to generate more revenue, it was, just to get the same amount of revenue, are we taxing as smart as we can? Mm-hmm. And so all these experts came together, and one of their very clear recommendations on the sales tax was that some of the exemptions needed to be lifted because there were so many exemptions in Connecticut that the base needed to be broadened, and when the base was broadened, the rate could be brought down. What we did is we actually built off of the state tax panel study and said the same thing, that you need to, and what we recommended was lifting 10% of the exemptions. And I'll tell you why we got to this level of recommendations in a moment. We recommended lifting, 10% of the exemptions at a minimum, which would bring the base, which would broaden the base enough that it would bring the state rate down to below 6%. Right now it's like 6.35. So it would bring the state rate down to below 6%. And then you add 1% on top of that. And that 1% that you add on top of that would go to municipal governments. And it would go for two reasons. The first, I think it's $325 million or so, would go to fully fund pilot. Would make up the whole pilot. So you wouldn't have to lean on anybody else to fund pilot, because if you do that, pilot is fully funded, you funded the gap. Then the remaining, 320 or 340 million would be divided up across all cities and towns in Connecticut using a formula that's currently the formula that's used for LoCIP. LoCIP's been in the news a little bit lately. We're not suggesting that this money be added to LoCIP. We're just suggesting that the LoCIP formula be what is applied. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the primary reason is that would evenly distribute the money to where everybody gets their share. Everybody has challenges and needs, and it would direct money to the smallest of communities, the most rural of communities, as well as, the larger urban centers. So not only do we identify the funding source, but we also go to great detail to identify how to distribute that funding source. That's very important. But to get to the issue of diversification and why below 6% and why the 1%, well, the one thing that was very important to all of the members of this panel was that Connecticut not only be on a sustainable path, but also a competitive path. That's, it can be sustainable for us internally, but if it's not competitive within the region, it's only going to hurt us. Well, we're not competitive in the property tax. It's one of the reasons why we have huge challenges now. But if you look at the sales tax, right now, Connecticut's sales tax is the second lowest in the region, collectively. You have Massachusetts is already slightly lower than us. So unless we just reduce our tax, we are already, Massachusetts is putting forth a better sales tax rate collectively. But New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, all of these surrounding states, that if we do this proposal and we broaden the base, lower the rate, and then add the additional 1% on, we are still going to have a lower rate than all of our other surrounding states, with the exception of the one state that has a lower rate than us now. So that is a very important part of this, is we've identified a way to create revenue diversification, maintain competitive in that area, increase our competitiveness in the area of the property tax, and identify what we believe is proper utilization of those funds to fund pilot and then to have the other money, distributed. What the last part of that proposal is, when it comes to the nonprofits, the current non-taxable entities, is if at some point down the road the state says we're going to reduce funding even further, even you guys have fully funded it now, created a revenue stream to do it, but we're going to try to reach in and do what the state has done historically, and we're going to take some of that revenue stream away, and you're going to be right back to where you started. If that occurs, then a trigger goes into place that these nonprofits who are enjoying this exemption have to now pay a portion not even the whole thing. It up 20% of the current mill rate portion to fill in part of that gap. And that does a couple things. I mean, number one, obviously it fills in the gap and creates a more sustainable system because cities and towns have to supply a variety of services, infrastructure services and everything else to these nonprofits. But the other thing that it does, to not be disingenuous, is it also creates another constituency group that puts us all in this together. If these nonprofits want to enjoy these exemptions, then they should be vested as well at going to the state if the state is not going to hold up to its end of the bargain and say, hey, wait a minute, state, you've got to fund this pilot because if you don't fund it, we're losing part of our exemption. And we think that that's a really bad thing to do. So it brings them, it gets a little skin in the game for them. You know, if they're going to enjoy, if the state is going to give them that benefit of being tax exempt, then that's fine. We've created a formula to cover it. But if the state wants to back off of its promises, they shouldn't just say, well, we don't care if the state backs off of its promises, we're still getting ours. We should be in it together as a community to make sure that we're all defending the tax base of the community so the community can continue to be vibrant.
You know, one of the things we've been criticized for in the past is not saying, you know, we want, or okay, how are you going to pay for it? So we're stepping up.
Mhm.
And you can be critical of us, but, you know, we're trying to put some things on the table that haven't been put on the table before. We've never gone real heavy on emphasizing municipal cost containment reduction strategies. We're putting out proposals on that front. This is not typical for us. You know, we're sort of entering a new area of thinking. So it's a lot of creative thinking. Some of it, you know, may garner a lot of support, some of it less, but, you know, in the past we were criticized for not doing this. So if people want to criticize us for doing this, you know, they're welcome to because, you know, we're trying to break some new ground.
And if I can comment on that also, I think it's very important that, you know, in the past, a lot of us as municipal leaders, we may complain about things that are happening at the state level. And I'm personally very fortunate. I work very closely with our three state legislators, Senator Len Pisano, Senator Martin Looney, and State Representative Dave Yacarino. All of them were close personal friends of mine long before we even entered these careers and professions. So we've got a good thing in that respect. This report is a report that not all of us agreed with every single component within the report, but we came together in a bipartisan fashion to collaborate even further with those state legislators, the Senate and the House, whom we either have relationships with or whom we don't know that well. This report is designed to say, here, look, we're working with you. Here are a number of different ideas and suggestions that we would ask you to consider. In the end, it'll have to be voted both in the Senate and the House. And we hope that there's some components of this that go forward. It's our way of demonstrating, hey, we're in this with you. We're trying to not be critical, but come up with what we see to be solutions. And here's a menu for you.
What's your biggest obstacle? I mean, is it changes on collective bargaining? And where do you see, have you gotten any feedback yet? I mean, obviously you just did this, but talking about the legislators that you do have a good relationship with, obviously that's critical. And, you know, if they're going to get behind you and...
The dialogue has been great from all of it. Actually, later today, I have meetings with more legislative leaders now that the report's out. But the dialogue has been great with the legislative leadership on both sides of the aisle. And in saying that, I would be completely misleading you if I said that before the report ever came out, you know, and we shared some of the ideas with them, that they said, I'm going to take this and back it wholeheartedly 100%. But what that dialogue is, it's not been that, but what that dialogue has been is that we're bringing up some very, very important points in an incredibly important discussion that needs to take place in Connecticut. And all of them that I've been in contact with have collectively agreed to that. Now, there may be areas in it that they find some levels of discomfort. There are areas in it that some of our membership finds levels of discomfort. The one thing I said is probably a pretty good report because there's stuff in there that labor doesn't like, there's stuff in there that some people in the business community don't like, there's stuff in there that the education establishment doesn't like, there's stuff in there that our membership doesn't like. Must be pretty good, you know. But that's been the conversation with them is, yes, we have to have these discussions. We can't put them off any longer. We have to create opportunities for our urban centers and our suburban centers and our rural communities to be vibrant and successful. What I've said all along to anybody who's directly critical of it is, I'm fine if you have another plan. Let's talk about it. Let's look at it. But if that plan is a plan to dump more pressure and more strain on the property tax, then it is the wrong plan. I won't go into any other plan with a caveat saying that this is right or this is wrong, except for that. We cannot afford to put further strain on the property tax. It's going to have a major negative impact on our suburban and rural centers, and frankly, our urban centers in some areas are going to fold because the property tax can't support them anyway. And that is a downward spiral sinking ship. So, you know, it's easy to sit in the cheap seats and not be part of a discussion, and then what other ideas that people come up with to be critical of them. It's a little different to sit at the table and to be part of difficult policy discussions, and that's what these municipal leaders from all across the state did. And they didn't sit there harmoniously and one of them would bring up an idea and all the rest of them would shake their head and say, yes, that's great, and let's move on. These were hours of robust discussions, and they were very, very data-driven. There were times that our municipal leaders came up with ideas that they collectively thought were really good ideas. And our consultants from outside of the state said, you can't do that, it's going to make you non-competitive, and here's why. You know, so that's why there was such a good balance between the two of bringing those people together. And you know, we understand that everything in it is not something that everybody's going to like, but we do think that it's a path to prosperity.
And there's strategies in here, obviously, that are going to be very helpful, we think, to the cities. And that's incredibly important because I think, and you know, Michael disagrees, he's going to say so, is that the regions, whether it be New Haven, Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, need vibrant cities. Most people in the suburbs commute to their city for a job. So it's in everyone's interest to have a strategy that's both helpful to the suburbs and the cities, but clearly the cities are economic engines in this state, and the degree to which we're going to pass to the next level of employment, people who are coming into the workforce now, they clearly want to be able to live close to work. They want public transportation. They're not as interested in cars. And Connecticut doesn't have a New York or a Boston, but there's no reason why Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury, Stamford can't be sort of mini engines and drivers of employment and really have Connecticut be a place that's going to be attractive to the next generation of workers.
I have a couple of questions about the sales tax proposals in this report. First off, you guys mentioned that the exemptions would have to be reduced, that 10% of the exemptions would have to be reduced. Does this report specify which exemptions you want to get rid of? There were reports that you didn't.
No, the report doesn't, and let me tell you why. Because we actually had drafts along the way where we did that in various different ways. And we actually thought about putting together a kind of a smorgasbord, if you will, of different combinations that you could do. But we really believe that this discussion needs to be a robust discussion in collaboration with legislators and with other people, you know, across the board in communities. So what we've said is we support generally that 10% reduction. The one caveat that's in the report that says that those reductions, we should avoid reductions to business units because we don't want anything that's going to hurt the business community at this point in time. But the rest of that needs to be done in a collaborative discussion with the legislature to get their ideas and their feelings, because I think whatever we put out in that regard, somebody's going to say, well, you should have done this one and not this one. We think that 10% is not a whole lot, and it's probably, instead of saying completely eliminate one or completely eliminate others, it may be a couple percentage points of an exemption here or there in some combination. So the report intentionally leaves that open for discussion because we don't think 10% is a hard number to get to, but we think it's a number that should be a collaborative discussion with our policy leaders at the state level.
Well, those exemptions, some of those exemptions are really popular, or at least they'd be really popular. People
Sure.
talked about taking them away. In
Yeah.
particular, the ones that come to mind are groceries, gas, medicine. Even if you took away only part of those exemptions, if you're looking at those kind of exemptions, bringing back taxes on those, wouldn't that tighten the squeeze on folks who live in high cost of living areas like the city of New Haven, where it's already pretty tough to pay the bills, and now the towns want to have potentially taxi groceries, which they don't currently do.
The way that I would respond to that is, yeah, all of these are difficult decisions on somebody. There's no question about it. The reality is, there is no way of doing this without some level of pain. The question is are we being competitive when we do it, or are we going in a downward spiral? And if you put all the pressure on the property tax, those are the people that are also paying the highest mill rates in the state. And the property tax is really disproportionately hitting the poor in these urban centers very heavily, and it's keeping these urban centers from providing more vibrant services for them and all of those types of things. So it's a matter of getting our one area where we are not competitive to a competitive level and looking at other areas where we can make modest adjustments and still remain competitive with both national standards and regional standards. Another thing that's in the report talks about that nobody's really focused on because they focused on the sales tax is the fee section for the use of the public rights of way. Connecticut's one of maybe 7 or 8 states in the nation that doesn't allow municipal governments to charge fees for the use of the public right of way.
You guys understand
Yeah,
that
what is
issue,
that?
you need,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
You
talk
guys
about
explain
that.
a little.
Well, you want to tap on that some, or it's basically the different towers and utility poles and all the different things that
They
are
dig
done.
up the road and
Dig
the side
up
of the
road.
street,
A lot of that's impact fees as well, but
So the simple way to describe it is the town has land that it's owned, and someone comes in and uses the land, but we cannot impose any fee for that, and the town land is then taken. So as Joe said, we're one of 7 states across the country that the municipal governments don't receive a fee or cannot impose a fee for a right-of-way on our land, for usage of our land, for whatever goes on that land. We just can't do it.
Then you have to often make repairs.
We have to make the.
there's been another
What would you
taxpayer
what would you be
dollars.
charging? Yeah, give us an example.
A cell tower, perhaps, cell tower going in. The towns can't control cell towers. That's something that even our planning and zoning commissions can't control. So if a cell tower gets mandated to come in and it's on the public land, we don't receive anything for that.
How about other things too, though, that,
There are a variety of different utilities, a variety of different things that it hits, and it's really interesting. If you look, we talk about revenue diversification, but if you look nationally, you basically have funding both at the state level and at the local level is divided up in 3 categories. It's taxes, it's fees, and then it's support, whether at the local level it's federal support and state support, or at the state level it's federal support. Connecticut has a lot of the challenges that it has because when you look at that pie in Connecticut compared to other states, our pie is all taxes. It's very, very little of that pie is fees. In fact, at the local government level here, I don't know if any of it's fees, which is really, really unusual. And then, like I said, also the proportion of dollars that we receive from the state and the federal government is significantly less as well. And at the state level, the proportional amount of dollars that they receive from the federal government is significantly less. So we do not have a diversified revenue structure at the local level or at the state level for that matter. And that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of the challenges that we have. And so, circling back to your original question about some of these exemptions and them being that popular, they are popular in a lot of ways, but do they always really make sense? And do they make sense in terms of creating a balanced revenue structure that doesn't make us non-competitive in certain areas? And, for example, Boat storage is one, like tax exemptions on things like boat storage. So, yeah, there are a ton of things in there that are very popular. There are also a lot of items in there that were very special interest driven, along the years that people have gotten in. And we just think when you're talking over $400 billion in exemptions, maybe it's time to sit down and look at them. And that's not just us saying that. Again, the legislature's own tax panel study that they commissioned last year came out with the exact same conclusion. It said you have to review these.
The state's recovery from the recession has been lagging behind others. The state's been running deficits last, budget after, you have to be open to say, okay, some things got to change.
Yeah.
I think we have enough years of data now that, the new reality from that post-2008 meltdown, you can see that the growth level is come back, but, the state is still running deficits. We got to change something. We just can't continue to do exactly the same thing.
So think of it this way. This may be one of the better ways to describe this. Right now, we're faced with, all of us, the threat of a major property tax increase at the local level because all of us are going to be cut back on municipal aid. So the items and components of this report are designed to ease that short-term major impact, because the number one issue in the state of Connecticut right now is taxes. And a lot of us at the municipal level are saying we can't pass it. We can't pass the cuts that we get back immediately into a tax increase for our residents. And our residents really want all the services that we provide. So we're stuck with, we can't really raise taxes, we can't really cut back services. So a lot of what's in this report is designed to sort of ease the burden of a looming immediate tax increase at the municipal level, because we will be cut back both on our town side and perhaps even on the education side with ECS.
And obviously, the property tax, residential property tax is a killer in New Haven. It's disincentive to buying a house. It's a disincentive to property values sustaining themselves. The percentage of owner-occupied housing in New Haven is like maybe 22%, 25%. You're not going to have a vibrant city if you don't find a way to increase owner-occupied housing, sustain housing values, and, part of the argument, for the urban centers is simply people have to live you get people to live in the city, you get people to buy property in the city, then that drives the vibrancy sort of coming up a little bit.
And the renters are good people too.
Renters pay property tax in most markets.
I don't need to say that. I'm not
I think the bigger issue is this, and I read a little op-ed almost a year ago about this, where Connecticut is really unique in this regard in our urban centers. You just don't see this anyplace else. To where all of the people who utilize city services that don't live in the city ride for free. And that just doesn't happen anywhere. Everything is put at the city level, all the burden is put on the city resident through the property tax. All the major property has been made tax exempt. So a lot of it is lower income people who are trying to support and keep an entire city propped up. That's why Hartford's in the challenges that it has. Meanwhile, you have, and I use myself as a perfect example. I make a good living to take care of my family in New Haven. And I drive into New Haven every day. I park in the garage, I use the streets, I use the fire protection, I use the water, I use the sewer, I use the public safety. When I'm in a parking garage, I'm not afraid, I'm not frightened, I feel like I'm in a safe area. I eat at the restaurants. Sometimes I bring people in and, for CCM work because we're located in New Haven and they stay at the hotels. I purchase my gas at the gas station. All I do is take money out of New Haven that then goes into my property taxes in the suburb community that I live in, but none of the taxes that I pay in New Haven go to New Haven, they all go to the state. None of them. Stay at the hotels in New Haven, no local tax. Buy gas in New Haven, no local tax. Eat at the restaurants in New Haven, no local tax. I utilize the police, I utilize the fire, I utilize the water, I utilize the sewer, all the things that I said, I pay absolutely nothing for that service. If we created a system for people such as myself to leech off of our urban centers, and then we wonder why they're failing. You know, New Haven is doing well. A, they do a lot of good management, but B, a lot of it is Yale. But if you take Yale out of the equation, New Haven's probably Hartford, you know, or Bridgeport, or Waterbury. I mean, that's why these places struggle, because they have to offer all of these services with no tax base to support it. And the only solutions that we have heard to this point have been the Robin Hood solutions. Well, let's go over and rob Greenwich and see if we can rob Greenwich enough to help Hartford. That's not sustainable. That's a short-term Band-Aid, which is, you know, trying to take money from a richer, a more wealthy community and give it to a poorer community. But what about if that well runs dry? And what we're putting together is a set of solutions to put tools in the toolbox to make these centers more self-sufficient, more in control of their own destiny, and less reliant on the state. Particularly now, you've got a state and federal government both that are in less and less of a position to support them. So the rules have been created to where you can't make it on your own, and we're going to support you. Now we can't support you anymore. We're saying, well, okay, if you can't support us anymore, you got to change the rules to where we can make it on our own. I think that's a lot of the play of the urban centers. And from CCM's perspective, we don't want it done through the Robin Hood effect. We don't think that it makes sense to go into the richer communities and to try to find a way to just pull money for those richer communities and throw them to the more struggling communities in order to fill a gap. We would rather, instead of putting a Band-Aid over the wound, we'd rather try to figure out why the wound got there to begin with and how to fix it going forward.
I do think, to Wes's point, though, that, you know, obviously a lot of this is open still to discussion, but if we decide as a state of Connecticut to take the exemption off food, that will make an impact on some of the good folks living in New Haven.
Of course.
At a higher level than some of the good folks living in Greenwich. And I'm not including everybody in that, obviously. But you know, a tax like that, when it's on food, if it's on clothing, it's one thing, because we can all decide, you know,
Sure.
We're going to shop at TJ Maxx or we're going to shop at Saks. You know, we make those decisions, and if we're going to pay a higher tax on one than another. But in terms of food, you know, and again, I'm not saying that that's what we're going to do, but I'm just saying let's just get on the table that some of these make more impact on people than.
And that's why I think it's important that discussion takes place, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why we look and we say it's not just about one area or another area. That's why I think you have to really sit down and weigh all of these exemptions that are on the books and see where you find that 10% and where it makes the most sense. And what I'm suggesting, I think the report is suggesting, is we've already shown our ability to put out difficult recommendations. We will sit at that table with our policymakers. We will make those difficult decisions with them. We will have that dialogue with them. And I think that dialogue will go much like what you just pointed out. I think it's very important that each one of these we understand, if we do this, how is it going to impact people?
When the panel, the municipal panel sort of hashed this out, that was one of the most debated areas.
Mm-hmm.
And it was vetted for quite some time.
This
Food tax?
oh, yes.
You know, what exemptions,
Yeah.
you know, if we were trying to do this, what exemptions would be swallowable?
This was something, and I mentioned it earlier, a lot of us don't agree on some of the components of this. This was a very controversial subject, but in an effort to get the product out in its entirety, we had to put our own personal differences aside among us as chief elected officials, say, all right, we're going to present a number of different options to our state legislators, and a lot of us had to swallow some of the things in here that we didn't really necessarily agree with.
And I would like to point out that the reason why these exemptions need to be talked about is the report makes it very clear. We could have just come in and said, add a 1% sales tax. Leave all the exemptions alone, but add 1% on the sales tax for municipal governments. Then we avoid the whole exemption conversation, which is a difficult conversation to have. But that would have put us at a position to where our sales tax rate would not have been competitive in the region as we needed it to be. So that's why as the tax panel study suggested, that's why the base needs to be broadened to get that rate down, so we can do that and maintain that competitive posture.
Separate from exemptions, I had another question about the sales tax. The Connecticut Mirror wrote about your guys' press conference yesterday, and they said in another part of the report that there would also be an opportunity for sections of the state to voluntarily increase the sales tax in their particular region and keep those funds for tourism, recreation, and other activities. They're saying that if it were supported by the Regional Council of Government and then approved by referenda, that a region could add 0.25 percentage point to their sales tax. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a local, well, and it's not to the whole tax, it's on specific categories, But the way that would work, first off, within the COG, you would have the one town, one vote type of thing, where you'd have to have the majority of towns in a COG say, we want to put this to referenda, and here's why. And then after it was put to referenda, it would go to the voters to determine if that was something that they wanted for their community.
So the COGS would have taxing authority?
No, it would actually be the voters would have the taxing authority.
The COGS would have the ability to put up the tax measure.
The COGS would have the ability collectively, not at the COG level, but the municipal leaders who made up the COG.
Right.
That's one of the frustrations sometimes I even have with CCM is people say CCM and forget that CCM is really a body of our members. Our members drive the agenda. The same thing with the COGS. It wouldn't be a government body as the COG doing this. It would be a collective of the membership who would say, we think that there's support in our community for this. We would like to collectively put it to referenda. If the majority of the people in the COG said that, then it would go out to referendum vote to the people within a community. And those recommendations are for very specific reasons. And again, when you talk about competitiveness, this isn't something that we just thought was, oh, this sounds like a great idea. This is something that's done in many parts of the country that have been successful.
But COG's putting out tax proposals and regionalizing services. Fellas, that sounds like county government. Do you guys want to bring back county government?
No, absolutely not. I don't think it's county government. I don't think, first of all, that it's ever bad to let people choose. Number one. As an old legislator, I used to always have that opinion. People would come to me with ideas that I completely disagreed with, and then they'd put on it, we're going to put it to referendum vote to the people, and I'd say, okay, I support the people making decisions. So, these are regional, we talk about some regional solutions. These are regional opportunities that may not work for any region in the state, may not work for any of them now, but might down the road. It's a tool in the toolbox. It may not be right for New Haven or Hartford, but it might be right for Litchfield, for something they want to do. But it's very much driven by, again, you have to have a collective of all of the municipalities that are in that COG, number one. It's a, one town, one vote type of thing where the majority comes up and says, we'd really like to put this to the voters. And then after the majority decides to put it to the voters, then it goes to the voters and the voters make that decision. And it's not on top of the entire sales tax. It's in specific areas. We asked the question yesterday, well, if you did this, and this, you might take the sales tax up to 8%. And so that's really not true. You might take it up to 8% on soda, or some specific area that as it's defined in here. But again, these are proposals that are based off of deep studies of what our region does and what the nation does in terms of putting tools in the toolbox for communities to be able to control their own destiny. I don't think, personally, that if that passed, that anywhere in the state of Connecticut is ready for that right now. I don't think any COG would put it to referendum. I'm just guessing. I don't think any COG would have enough votes right now to put it to referendum. And if they did, I don't think the people would support it. But times change and opportunities change. And if a collective of communities looks and says, listen, we think we can really do a lot to support tourism in this area, and we're really creating a lot of growth, and we feel like we need to have more investment here, then the community can make that decision. And hopefully if these other provisions and proposals get put into effect, we'll be to a position where communities will want to grab onto those things and grow even more. Right now, we're not trying to grow in a lot of areas, we're trying to survive. And this puts us back on a path to stability and then hopefully vibrancy after that. And then if there's more tools in the toolbox when you hit the point of vibrancy that can keep you there, then that's, to me, that's a win.
Why would the city of New Haven, that was my last question, why would the city of New Haven, which has a lot of residents, support a COG system that gives them one town, one vote, that gives them as many votes in that COG system as West Haven, which has far fewer residents? Why would New Haven embrace that model?
Well, the one thing I would say to that is if you get to referendum, well, they might have the one town, one vote model at the COG level. The New Haven residents are going to have a disproportionate ability to override that referendum at the local level because they're going to bring more votes to the polls by having more. So it balances out that way. So
But there are people who would be affected by whatever measure the COG does. So it makes sense that they have more power.
Wes, the way the COGs have worked, I've been in office 7 years, it's always been in the south central region that we call it SCROG. There's 15 of us as chief elected officials. Each of us have an equal vote. That's the way it's been even before we, in the current COG format, came into the COG.
But how much governing power do the COGs have in terms, especially the COGs don't currently have a power to put forth measures for taxation, right?
That's correct. Yeah, they do not. Yeah.
So, I mean, what would you say is the most impactful thing that COGs do in terms of policy making?
Transportation. I would say that the biggest thing within our Council of Governments and probably others is the flow of federal dollars that come into our COG for transportation issues, defined by roads, bridges, infrastructure improvement. All of us, every single one of the 15 of us that are in this COG, New Haven included, transportation is the lifeblood of our Council of Governments right now.
But would you agree that putting a taxation measure to referendum, that's a dramatic shift in the powers of the COG, isn't it?
I think to Joe's point, it's not the COG as one entity that can impose it. There's 15 people within the COG that would have to agree to it, and at least presently, it may not pass in the South Central COG. But it's just another suggestion on how to do something for the future as things continue to appear to be very bleak for the future.
There's a, large pool of thought out there that, and this is not to advocate county government, but the ability of the COGs to access transportation funding and other funding is being maximized more in other states where there is, the counties are more robust. So one of the things we've been thinking of is trying to find ways without going to county government to empower the COGs, because frankly, they're leaving money on the table that they could access because they're not more organized.
They're not recognized that way at the federal level. Now, and that's Kevin's right. That's not part of this report, but it's part of the legislative proposal that we're working on. We talked about not being diversified, and part of it being that we don't receive much federal funding or state funding. One of the reasons why we don't receive as much federal funding as other states is there's a lot of federal funding that is identified to go to county type systems or things that are written up as county type systems. So there's this understanding, there's this desire to figure out, is there a way to define the COGs in Connecticut, not as county governments, but define them in terms that they will meet those requirements at the federal level to be able to pull down that federal funding. And you're talking about several tens of millions of dollars that they don't qualify for just because of the way that they're defined now. So that's not something that's in this report, but it is a very important conversation that's taking place because we are leaving a lot of federal dollars on the table. Nobody has a desire within CCM or our membership. There's no appetite to create another level of bureaucracy or to go back to a county government system. But if there are ways that we can design the COGs better to where they can draw down that federal money that they're not eligible for now, it would make a lot of sense, I think, for us to do that.
We are trying to get to Hartford. I apologize.
Yes.
So
Okay.
and I'm sure you guys got a lot of stuff to do. So I'm just saying if we could try to get where you guys want to end up.
Yes, so, I think we can wrap up here, and I think if Mary has any other questions, she can contact you
Yeah,
guys.
absolutely.
Thank you.
We really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Helen.
We do.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate your time.
We enjoyed this.
Very